Now, a lawyer for John Bolton says he will testify in the Democrats' impeachment inquiry, but only if he's subpoenaed. Lawmakers want the former national security advisor to speak about President Trump's approach to Ukraine. Bolton, who left the administration back in September, has been mentioned in the opening statements of several witnesses who've already testified. Those statements cite Bolton as being a sharp critic of the administration's relationship with the country. In one instance, calling it crazy. While Democrats might be hoping he'll be their star witness, John Gans warns that Bolton's unlikely to be an impeachment hero. He writes, quote, the president's former national security advisor might have opposed the Ukraine scheme, but he also spent his career fighting for the power of the presidency and the limits of congressional inquiry. And John joins us now from Philadelphia. He's a former Pentagon speechwriter as well and has some snazzy headphones on to round it out. We appreciate you spending some time with us, John. Just lay out for us Bolton's beliefs in your view when it comes to the powers of the executive branch compared to the legislative.
Absolutely. And his latest demand that he will testify if subpoenaed is sort of right in line with what he said for a long time, which is that he is largely speaking, and has been since the late 70s, sort of very protective of the executive branch's authority to sort of enforce the foreign policy it chooses to sort of pursue. And that involves pushing back to some extent about Congress's ability to investigate the president and hold it accountable on foreign policy matters. He was a person who actually thought that Watergate was the Congress overreacted to Watergate and tried too hard to get to the bottom of Iran-Contra and other scandals. And so this latest scandal and this latest impeachment inquiry really does put his views in the crosshairs, in part because it is pretty clear from testimony so far that he had some concerns with what happened in the Ukraine affair, but his inability and really his long-held principles that, in fact, Congress doesn't really have the right to question the president in these matters is going to make it hard for him to really open up and really just sort of give a full accounting of what he saw in the White House.
Well, his testimony really could be insightful and fascinating. I mean, let's not forget there were reports that President Trump was reluctant to even bring him on because he didn't like his mustache. Unclear if Bolton has gotten over that. But if you're suggesting that Bolton will want to protect the powers of the presidency, but perhaps isn't as loyal to President Trump himself, what might his testimony look and sound like?
Well, as I sort of explained in the piece, and sort of having written a book that sort of led from the White House warriors and the National Security Council from President Truman to President Trump, as you sort of said, John Bolton didn't shave his mustache when it sort of stood between him and a job. I doubt he's going to change his stripes to try and really undermine President Trump. He might be frustrated. He might have been sort of disappointed with some of the decisions that President Trump made, including the one that sort of led to his departure in September, which is still sort of contentious. So what I think you'll see is that what John Bolton will probably do is try to separate the wrongdoing and separate any sort of the problems and concerns he had from the office of the presidency itself. So a good example of this is what we've heard so far, right? He sort of complained about Rudy Giuliani being a hand grenade, or that this drug deal, as he called it, was being cooked up by Ambassador Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, and the White House chief of staff, right? Who is the person that is not being discussed in any of those quotes? It's Donald Trump. So my suspicion is that he is going to try to be, if he testifies, it'll be done reluctantly, and then it will be done rather narrowly. And he will do everything he can to protect the privilege and sort of some of the protected conversations that he had with President Trump over Ukraine and a lot of other matters.
Really interesting. Now, you mentioned the book you've written about the history of the National Security Council, and in a recent op-ed for the New York Times entitled How John Bolton Broke the NSC, you write that Bolton, quote, weakened one of the few constraints that kept Trump from running foreign policy by the seat of his pants, end quote. So how has the NSC evolved under the president? And, you know, I think back to the execution of al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, reports that acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney wasn't even aware. What do you suspect is taking place right now when it comes to President Trump's decision-making on these matters and the constraints that should be there?
Yeah, so the National Security Council itself was created to sort of rein in informal and to a degree what one president called juggling, where the president was really having to make decisions almost on his own and with just a handful of aides about matters of war and peace, nuclear weapons, and things along those lines. And so the National Security Council was created 70 years ago after World War II to make sure presidents didn't have to do this alone. The deal was, let's get everybody in the room, let's get everybody talking, let's get everybody to come to some decisions, and then help make sure they're implemented. And the job of National Security Advisor itself was dedicated to that basic task of integrating and then, to a degree, making sure that the policies are enacted as the president decides. What John Bolton did when he came in was in part due to President Trump. President Trump's a very irregular president and had a hard time dealing with the regular order of policymaking. And so, to a degree, John Bolton knew that there would be some appeal in getting rid of some of that regular order. So he informalized the process, both to help President Trump sort of make decisions, but also to help John Bolton pursue his own foreign policy decisions and foreign policy principles on Iran and North Korea. And so by minimizing the importance of the National Security Council, by getting rid of a lot of the meetings and memoranda that had sort of been used to sort of help inform presidents in their decision making, Donald Trump was basically unleashed, right? And as John Bolton fell out of favor in the spring and then in the summer, what you found is that Donald Trump was really operating alone. And this Ukraine is a very good example of what happens when a president like Donald Trump is sort of left to his own devices. And we're seeing the ramifications, not just abroad in Ukraine, where there's real tensions and real issues and real security threats, but also at home, where Congress, where people in the government don't like what is happening. And so this, John Bolton's decisions to formalize the process have basically led us to this moment.
And we're going to hear a little bit more about that later in this program. We appreciate your insight. You're at home. I think I heard a kid in the background there. So thank you for making space for us. Parenting is tough, I'm told.
Well, it's trick or treat time, so I got invaded. So I appreciate your patience.
All right. We appreciate you. Thanks very much, John Gans.
Thanks so much.